A new peaceful minerals deal between the US and the Democratic Republic of the Congo has turned global attention to Africa's mineral reserves, and tech giants are paying close attention. Bill Gates-backed Cobalt Metals is reported to be watching the arrangement closely, signaling a deeper convergence between the tech and mineral industries. So what does this blending of interest mean for Africa's negotiating power and its technological future? Well, joining us in the studio is Noëlle van der Waag-Cowling, training lead at the Cybersecurity Institute at the University of Stellenbosch. Hi, Noëlle, so nice to speak to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Linda. Thanks for having me on the show.
Well, at the IT Web Security Summit in Joburg, you spoke about the growing convergence between technology and mineral interests. So how should Africa navigate this shift?
Well, I think it's such a complex field because it's actually set up against the background of the so-called tech wars that have already been underway for at least 5 years. The race between the hyperpowers to get across the line, specifically in terms of quantum computing, the first power to have quantum computing, where you see a lot of contestation coming in, especially around chip manufacturing and equipping one another to do that, be able to harness and utilize artificial intelligence the best. So we've already seen a number of moves in the so-called tech wars going on between the great powers, if we can put it that way. So where does this leave Africa? Well, essentially Africa is endowed with a large deposit of these critical minerals that are so important for technology development going forward. Africa as a whole, especially Southern Africa as a region and Central Africa, have not sat down and had strategic discussions among nations about potentially how they would approach this. Is it worthwhile approaching it as a bloc? Certainly, when we talk about a common African position in diplomacy, we talk about a common position of Africa being the largest single bloc in the United Nations, 54 states, and how powerful actually a common African position can be in terms of voting rights in a forum, for example, like the United Nations. So Africa has the ability to leverage this African states, especially if they're acting potentially with common purpose. I think the question is, what would we potentially as Africans like to see Africa do with its critical minerals endowment? And potentially one looks to the Middle East and the discovery of oil and what that actually meant for the nations of the Middle East who had large oil deposits, and how we've seen so many of them. You think specifically of states like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, etc., and how they actually harness that oil to build sovereign wealth funds and to uplift their people so dramatically, and then take from that and start diversifying the economies. They are economic powerhouses. So that should be the dream, is what does Africa do? We've got critical minerals. This is yet another opportunity for Africa, potentially maybe one of its last opportunities, to say, how do we derive maximum benefits from what we have under our soil?
Well, the Middle East was able to do this, but they have tiny populations compared to Africa's large populations. And of course, there's the issue of governance in Africa.
Yes. So I think we wouldn't be looking at a situation similar to the Middle East, where you actually see that on a personal level, it's made the bulk of the population in those countries actually quite wealthy. But really what Africa can take from this is to build out that middle class, to build out the small businesses that would support in the value chain and start creating sustainable, stable jobs within the middle class, and tax revenue, proper tax revenue. African countries are not actually, they're under collecting on tax by a huge margin. So these are the opportunities that presents to actually start building out of this the capable, stable state. And economic growth, reliable economic growth that's got to match that population growth that Africa has. Of course, the big question is here, it's a question of governance, it's a question of capable state, and Africa has in the past had corruption issues. And I think this is potentially what stands behind in the way of seeing this endowment translate into widespread economic benefit is empowerment and upliftment of the already ruling elites in Africa. I think this is the challenge ahead of us, because there are already existing minerals deals that do not benefit populations at large.
Well, what should Africa ask in fair return for its critical minerals? In other words, the deal in the DRC was peace in exchange for minerals. What should they ask for? Should they ask, come and build our tech industry, come and give us, the infrastructure that we need?
Well, on that DRC deal specifically, you talk about the security development nexus. So it's very difficult to have development without security. Security, human security, economic security, state stability is a precursor to investment. Capital doesn't follow in security. So it's not actually a bad deal in that sense. I think it's something the DRC sorely needs. What Africa obviously needs is infrastructure, but we've been down this road before. We see infrastructure deals with certain countries that often result in debt trap diplomacy going down in Africa. So what does Africa need out of this? The first and foremost is Africa needs to stop allowing itself to have extractive economies. So where these critical minerals are mined, I think we'd first and foremost like to see the refinement and manufacturing component also vested in those African states, creating, just as I'm saying, the actual jobs in Africa, the downstream beneficiation for small businesses, suppliers, etc., to be taking place. If it remains extractive, it's always going to be problematic. We're getting just the bottom part of the whole deal out of it. So that's the first thing. I think secondly, yes, we could start thinking more broadly than just infrastructure, but, saying, help us build the manufacturing plants, help us bring in some skills, and let's do some capacity building and turn that into actual hard capabilities. So capacity building is also something that just goes on and on and on and never often realizes in actual hard capabilities. And that is what we should be after.
And also build out our Africa's IT infrastructure?
Yeah, so I mean, Africa's IT infrastructure is currently already being built out at a rapid rate. If you're looking at telecommunications networks, I think, though, what we're not seeing is the build out of potentially the massive data centers that are going to be able to harness and carry the artificial intelligence load that is going to be at the epicenter of computing going forward. So we're not just talking about cloud computing data centers. And what we see a lot of there, of course, then you need sufficient energy security to power those data centers. And we're looking at things already taking place like nuclear pebble bed reactors. I'm not a fan of nuclear, but I'm also not a fan of, necessarily carbons. I think pebble bed reactors, small ones that actually service specifically those data centers, maybe mixed with renewables, is the way to go. And it's that type of infrastructure we should be looking at, not just bland kind of, okay, let's get some more telecoms networks in place, but sort of high-end technology infrastructure development.
Could Africa start negotiations with the tech firms themselves, or should it still be through governments?
I think the tech firms would depend on what the actual end goal is. So if they are wanting to procure minerals directly from states, then by all means. If it's a government-to-government type of operation, then that brings, obviously other benefits and negotiations to the table. So, what we often lose sight of when we talk about non-state actors is we often think of something like an insurgent group or a terrorist group or something like that. But the reality is that a lot of these, shall we call them the hyperscalers, these massive tech firms, the Microsofts, Huawei's, Googles of the world, are in fact very powerful non-state actors. And you will often see them at the center increasingly of policy direction. Think of Starlink and its role in certain conflicts, for example. So I would imagine that we can foresee them going directly in to make these deals to secure the types of critical minerals they're going to need, especially for things like chip manufacturing, etc. And then by all means do the deals. But those deals have to be in terms of also thinking about the public good and long-term benefit for both parties. And I think too often in the past we've thought very short-term as Africa about mineral exports, and we're not thinking about really vesting that whole basket of benefits within Africa. And we do need to start thinking that way.
Well, some European countries now have what they call technology ambassadors. Is this what Africa needs?
Definitely. So many European countries have got both technology ambassadors as well as cybersecurity ambassadors. So they've built out an entire sort of suite, and technology is what drives the world these days. So to actually have these tech ambassadors out there, I think would be a really good idea, especially for these critical mineral bearing states. But also for a whole host of other reasons. We need to have far more agency within the technology sphere. We need to understand as well and have far more input into things like the responsible use of AI, and where taxes paid from the hyperscalers. We Africans are using a huge amount of technology services that are exported into Africa, but these are obviously not seen in the traditional basket of import-exports when arguments go down, for example, about tariffs. And very often the tax is not levied and derived in an African country, but Africans are using all these services. So there's a whole range of discussions that needs to happen around taxation at source.
So you said Africa has not had the key conversation about minerals and technology. So what's stopping them? And who needs to lead that shift?
Well, I think to a certain extent that it's not always evident to all of us exactly what conversations have been had where. One would hope that at regional level with the so-called trading blocs like a SADC or an ECOWAS, that in fact these conversations are going down. But we're not at this point seeing those conversations translating into any types of potential policies or white papers or anything like that. And I think that's a bit of a concern. What is stopping it? Well, I think to a certain extent a bit of bureaucratic malaise, or potentially not enough strategic foresight and wanting to actually shape narratives and take control of our futures could be part of that problem. But then there's another problem, I think, where each state that has a critical minerals endowment is often looking at what can they get, and they don't necessarily want to be bound down by some other state saying, no, don't do it this way, we all agreed we're going to do it that way. So you can already see the contestation of interests within a bloc, for example, coming to the fore. So one would hope that in fact, as I've said, that states would start understanding that as a bloc, if certain principles, if there's certain overarching principles that can be agreed upon in terms of how do we shape the critical minerals narrative and perhaps trading flows, and have agency in how that's going to look going forward into the future, that we can all benefit from, even if it's a set of overarching guiding principles, and keeping an open discourse with one another. You have to look at something, I'm not a cartel sort of fan, but you have to look at something like an OPEC and understand how powerful that actually is, in terms of controlling oil flows or the amounts of oil on the market. And they do that for a reason. So I'm not advocating for going that route, but I am saying collective action has its strengths. And we should be talking to our neighbors about how are we going to do this? How are we going to derive benefit for our regions? Because, again, you can't be a hyper-successful country in a broken region.
And you talked about the data center, the data centers that need to come to Africa. And South Africa, I think, is getting some of it. And they're talking about these pebble bed mini reactors for it. So is there massive potential for that all over Africa?
Well, I think the pebble bed reactors can go up wherever, They and because they're co-located, the ideas with the data centers, you're not looking at a huge investment in transmission lines and centralized transmission and all that type of thing. That's what makes them attractive, is they create a mini self-sustaining ecosystem on their own with the data center. And I think that's the point, is you start gaining sort of energy diversification out of that and energy security out of that diversification, simply because we're often sitting with one supplier in the African context, often a national supplier, and that represents a massive single point of failure in terms of energy security. If it goes down, you have a huge issue. So I think there is that. South Africa has been in sorts of talks. At this point, I don't actually think of that there's something tangible on the ground. I think there are people that are interested in having talks about getting it off the ground, but it's certainly in a very nascent sort of state at the moment, I think.
So the problem is, as we see in the DRC, that critical minerals drive conflict, and especially in the Sahel region of Africa. So how do we mitigate that risk and this drive to get minerals from Africa? They're not going to get anything if there's violence or war.
Well, this is exactly it. I think critical minerals are now a conflict driver in Africa. And we've seen this exactly in the DRC, going back to that. In the fog of war in the DRC that has been going on for 3 decades and plus, a lot of what happens there is that there's profiteering in wartime because there's less regulation, there's less control, and a lot of money can be made. This is Africa's danger. This can either be critical minerals, Africa's a really enormous chance to uplift large sections of Africa, or it could be Africa's downside in terms of leading to an explosion of conflicts, in fact. And we only have to look at, for example, the Central African Republic, which has a large endowment of critical minerals. It's not in a lot of players' interests that peace come to there, because there are too many players on the ground. See the same thing in the DRC. And I think this is the fear, will critical minerals, in fact, be Africa's downfall rather than Africa's savior, so to speak. And it's up to us. It's up to us in terms of how we manage this going forward. But the one thing that it needs to be successful is stable, accountable government. That is what's going to mean that critical minerals can be to the benefit. But I think if there is self-interest at play, we're going to have problems.
So do you think the focus of President Trump on critical minerals, well, obviously because of the competition from China, do you think that's a good thing for Africa?
The contestation's already there. If we have a look at Russia's Wagner Group, which is now renamed the Africa Corps, where they are operating in Africa is where there are critical minerals. That is specifically why I think they're in those places. So China has a footprint. There are many foreign powers with a footprint in Africa in the mining industry. I think Trump is realizing that perhaps the US was actually behind the 8 ball on the critical minerals, getting in the door and securing ongoing and future supplies of critical minerals. And you saw it where it was part of his negotiations with Ukraine. It's part of why he's interested in Greenland, and it's why he's also zeroed in on the DRC. I think America was behind, potentially. The question for Africa is, if we've got everyone interested in what we've got, how do we balance that against our own national interests as African states? And it's not just a quick economic one and done, but our critical minerals endowment has to benefit our national interest in the long term. And with everything that means, from security to growing our economies to growing our people. And that's the difficulty, I think, when you're dealing with large powers who really want access to this and who are prepared to make deals that look really, really good. You actually do need to go and have, actually, as part of your whole national strategy, is where do critical minerals fit in? and how are we going to go forward with them? And this is, I think, why conversations on a regional level are also so important, because our security is connected, our economies are connected.
Well, Noëlle van der Waag-Cowling, thank you so much.
Thank you, Linda.